There are houses that swallow grief whole, and there are houses that merely hold it at the door until it finds another way inside. "You left mud on the vestibule tiles again," Lady Pemwick said, not looking up from her correspondence. She had a talent for accusation, without the effort of eye contact. Her handwriting was the careful, looping sort that concealed spite behind ceremony. "I shall have it docked from your wages." Mira did not flinch. She stood in the doorway of Lady Pemwick's morning room with a ledger pressed to her ribs and the particular posture of a woman who had learned that stillness cost nothing. The mud in question was barely a smear, less than a smear, honestly, the ghost of a smear. But Lady Pemwick's housekeeper had already confirmed its existence with the kind of satisfaction that only the loyal lackey can produce. Mira had been outdoors before 5 in the morning to assess the kitchen garden for the week's provisioning. The ground was wet. The ground was always wet at Pemwick Hall in late October. These were facts that did not interest Lady Pemwick. "Yes, my lady," Mira said. It was the safest answer, not an apology. She had stopped apologizing in March, when she realized apologies cost the same as arguments and produced identical results. Simply an acknowledgement that sound had traveled between them. Lady Pemwick added a curlicue to a letter P and moved on. Mira crossed the room to the writing table in the corner, the one they did not call her desk because she did not officially have a desk, and she opened the ledger. 3 weeks until the quarterly accounts were due to the estate agent in York. She had 4 discrepancies to explain that were not, in fact, her discrepancies. They were Lady Pemwick's son's gambling debts rerouted through the household accounts as household expenditure, and she had to explain them in a way that concealed the crime without signing her own name to it. This was what Mira had become, the woman who made other people's dishonesty legible. She had arrived at Pemwick Hall 14 months earlier as a companion, following the death of her father. The Honorable Gerald Ashworth had died leaving a county estate so thoroughly mortgaged that even the name had a debt attached to it. Mira had sold the last of her mother's good earrings, paid the solicitors their final fee, and written to her father's cousin, Lady Pemwick, in the spirit of family obligation. Lady Pemwick had written back with the language of charity and the arithmetic of a woman who needed cheap labor she could dress as kindness. Mira had not been naive enough to misread the letter. She had been practical enough to accept it anyway, because the alternative was worse, and she knew it. In the 14 months since, she had graduated from companion to something with no title at all. She managed the household books. She corresponded with tradesmen. She produced menus, negotiated with the butcher on Tuesdays, supervised the kitchen garden schedule, and occasionally sat beside Lady Pemwick at evening card parties, silent and useful as a footstool. For this, she received £12 a year and a room on the 3rd floor that faced north. The room was cold. She did not complain about the cold. What she had not expected, what she had, in fact, never once explained to herself with any satisfying logic, were the flowers. They had begun in September. The first morning she had noticed them, she had assumed someone had left a cutting by accident, a small bunch of rosemary and late aster, tied with a strip of rough twine, sitting on the outer ledge of her north-facing window. She had looked at them for a moment, decided they were not her business, and gone back to her ledger. The next morning, there were 2 stems of bronze chrysanthemum. The morning after that, a sprig of sage and 2 perfect seed heads of wild teasel, architecturally arranged in the way that suggested someone had considered them rather than grabbed them in passing. After a week, she began to watch for them. After 2 weeks, she began to wait. The gardener she knew by sight, an older man named Tobias, broad-shouldered and unhurried, who worked the kitchen and cutting gardens with the quiet authority of a man who trusted plants more than people. She had spoken to him twice, once to ask about the parsnip yield and once to report a drainage problem near the east wall. He had answered both questions with the economy of someone who found words redundant when action was available. He had not, to her knowledge, ever looked at her north-facing window. She had not asked him about the flowers. She was not sure why. In the 2nd week of October, Lady Pemwick announced that the Duke of Aldenmere was coming. The announcement was made at breakfast, with the drama Lady Pemwick reserved for things she wanted to seem casual about. "He requires lodging," she said, spooning her egg with the precision of someone timing a detonation. "He has business in the area. Naturally, as his nearest relation in the county, I offered." Mira looked up from the supply list she was annotating beside her plate. She did not know the Duke of Aldenmere except as a name. She knew the name because it was attached, in the county registers she had worked through when settling her father's affairs, to a parcel of land in the northeastern corner of Westmoreland, so vast it generated its own weather. She also knew it because his solicitors had written to Lady Pemwick last spring about a contested drainage easement, and Lady Pemwick had made Mira draft the reply, and Mira had filed the correspondence neatly in the household papers and not thought of it again. "He arrives Friday," Lady Pemwick said. "You will ensure the blue rooms are aired and properly provisioned. And Mira," she paused in a way that was structurally identical to a threat, "you will make yourself less conspicuous. He is not here to notice you." Mira made a note in the margin of the supply list. Blue rooms, blue rooms, blue rooms, until the ink went through the page. Not from agitation, only to keep her hand occupied. He arrived on a Friday afternoon when the light was the color of old pewter and the wind off the moor carried the first honest bite of winter in it. Mira was in the front hall, auditing the linen cupboard inventory, when the coach came up the drive. She was not positioned to watch arrivals. The front hall linen cupboard was, in her working judgment, in the front hall, and she had not moved to the hall window. She was simply there, and the window happened to face the drive. The coach was larger than she had expected. The horses were the kind that require no commentary. He stepped out and the groom said nothing, and the front steps said nothing, and the air, briefly, said nothing. Aldrich, Duke of Aldenmere, was tall in the way that does not announce itself. It simply occupies. His hair was a dark, weather-rough brown, and his jaw carried the close-cropped suggestion of a beard he had not bothered to remove, which on another man might have read as negligence, but on him read as deliberateness. He wore a wool greatcoat the color of charcoal, and he carried it the way men carry things they have forgotten they are wearing. His eyes, from the window's distance, were light, gray or pale blue, she could not determine, and they moved across the facade of the house with the brief, methodical sweep of a man who was taking inventory rather than arriving. Lady Pemwick materialized at the bottom of the steps in a manner that suggested she had been waiting behind the door, which she had been. He descended the steps without hurrying. He shook Lady Pemwick's hand rather than bowing over it, which made Lady Pemwick's smile wobble at the right corner. Mira noted this. She noted it with the reflexive neutrality of a woman who had noted things all her life without anyone noticing her note them. She returned to the linen inventory. She counted pillowcases. She did not count them correctly. That evening she was asked to present the household accounts to the Duke's solicitor, a Mr. Farrand, who had traveled with the party and intended to review the estate's outstanding easement matter before the end of the week. Lady Pemwick conveyed this information as though it were a small clerical task. She added, as an afterthought, that Mira should present the books to Mr. Farrand in the library at 8 o'clock. She did not add that the Duke himself would be there. He was standing at the east window when Mira entered, one hand in the pocket of his evening coat, looking out at a garden he could not possibly see in the dark. He turned when she came in. He looked at her with the inventory expression, the same sweep she had seen from the window, and it lasted 2 full seconds before he looked at the books in her arms. "You are the accounts keeper," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." He said nothing else. He moved to the chair beside the library table and sat, and Mr. Farrand arrived 30 seconds later in a flurry of papers and apologies, and the meeting proceeded with such velocity that Mira had very little time to think about the fact that the Duke of Aldenmere had looked at her for 2 full seconds. She thought about it anyway, later, in her north-facing room, in the cold. The meeting had surfaced something she had been half aware of for weeks. In cross-referencing the accounts to answer Mr. Farrand's questions, she had been forced to lay 3 ledgers side by side, and in doing so she had seen, unavoidably, like seeing a shape in a carpet once you have seen it you cannot unsee, the true shape of what Lady Pemwick's son, Mr. Harwick Pemwick, had done to the household books. It was not mere rerouting of gambling debts. It was systematic, patient, quarterly extraction, totaling. She worked it out in the margin of her candlelit page that night. £462 over 18 months. It had been routed through the household provisioning accounts in parcels small enough not to alarm a casual reader. It would alarm a thorough one. Mr. Farrand, she suspected, was a thorough reader. She also suspected that when he finished reading, the name on the accounts as the responsible keeper of those records would be hers. She sat with this understanding for a long time. The candle burned down. At some point past midnight, she became aware that the wind had dropped, and in the new silence, she became aware of something else. Footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, crossing the gravel of the back garden path 2 floors below. She did not get up to look. She recognized the weight of those footsteps, or she told herself she did, which amounted to the same thing. In the morning, her windowsill held 3 stems of winter jasmine, pale yellow and sharp sweet, in a small clay pot she had never seen before. The pot was new. That meant someone had brought it deliberately, not just left stems in the usual casual way. It meant the gesture had graduated into something with more forethought, and Mira stood looking at it with the ledger still under her arm, and the particular feeling of a person whose orderly defenses have been moved 2 inches to the left without their permission. She had no time for that feeling. She had 4 hours before Mr. Farron's second review. She spent those 4 hours producing a clean supplementary memorandum. 3 pages, double witnessed by her own signature and dated, that laid out every discrepancy, its origin, and the paper trail that led not to her hand but to Harwick Pemwick's. She was precise. She was merciless in the way that only the accurate can be merciless. She named sums: £14 in June, £31 in August. The eye-watering £108 routed through a fictitious farriery contract in September. She attached copies of the original receipts, which she had kept, not out of prescience, but out of the professional habit of keeping everything, because you never knew when everything would matter. She arrived at Mr. Farron's morning session and placed the memorandum on the table before he had finished his coffee. He read it. He read it again. He set it down and looked at her with the expression of a man who has just realized he is in a room that has rearranged itself while he was looking elsewhere. "These are serious charges," he said. "They are accurate records," Mira said. She did not add anything. She had found that adding things weakened precise statements. It was at this moment that the library door opened and the Duke walked in. He had not been invited to the morning session. He was apparently not a man who required invitations to rooms and houses where he had business. He stood at the threshold and looked at the memorandum on the table, and then at Mira, and then at Mr. Farron. "What is this?" he said. It was not quite a question. Mr. Farron explained. He was good at explaining, rapid and precise, which was probably why the Duke employed him. The Duke listened without interrupting. He did not look at Mira during this explanation. He looked at the memorandum. He looked at the window. He looked at the memorandum again. Then he looked at Mira, and this time it lasted longer than 2 seconds. "You kept copies," he said. "I keep everything," Mira said. A pause. Short, weighted, the kind of pause that is doing more work than the words on either side of it. "Farron," the Duke said, "send for Lady Pemwick and her son." What followed was not pleasant, but it was swift, because financial exposure of this kind is always swift once the light gets to it. Harwick Pemwick entered the library 12 minutes later with the slightly flushed complexion of a man who has been halfway through a morning brandy, and he looked at the memorandum on the table and went the color of the library's cream plasterwork. Lady Pemwick entered behind him and looked at Mira with an expression that cycled through several stages before settling on a species of fury so cold it had nearly crystallized. "This is fabrication," Lady Pemwick said. Her voice had the ornate, ringing quality of a woman who had refined her condescension into art. "The girl is attempting to cover her own mismanagement with calumny. She has never been trustworthy. I have said so from the start. A woman of reduced circumstances, making accusations against her betters, is nothing new and nothing credible." "The dates," the Duke said. He had not moved from his position near the window. His voice was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that you adjust yourself to, the way you adjust to low ceilings. "I beg your pardon," Lady Pemwick said. "The dates on the receipts she has attached, and the dates on the originals Farron has in the easement correspondence file. They match." He paused, to the penny. Lady Pemwick looked at her son. Her son looked at the floor. Lady Pemwick looked at Mira, with an expression that said, very clearly, that whatever happened next, this was Mira's fault for having a memory, and the moral stubbornness not to use it to anyone's convenience, but the truth's. Mira looked back. She did not look away. She had stopped looking away from Lady Pemwick in March as well, on the same day she had stopped apologizing, and the habit had held. The matter of Harwick Pemwick's extracted £462 was settled, in legal terms, over the following 8 days. He would repay the household account from his quarterly allowance in structured installments. Lady Pemwick would sign a formal acknowledgement, drafted by Mr. Farrand. No magistrate would be involved, the Duke had decided, because the family disgrace was sufficient, and a public proceeding served only theatre. Mira was absolved from the records, in writing, in Mr. Farrand's hand, with the Duke's signature beside it. She held the document for a long moment in the library, alone, after everyone else had left. She was not sure what she felt, exactly. Safe was too simple. Vindicated was too proud, or at least too loud for the quiet feeling it was. What she felt was something closer to the particular relief of a person who has been braced for impact for so long, that when the impact does not come, their muscles do not know what to do with themselves. She put the document in the household papers file. She closed the file. She went to audit the kitchen garden for the last planting of autumn brassicas. The following morning, her windowsill had snowdrops. This was, she noted, botanically impossible in the 3rd week of October. Someone had grown them under glass and brought them there. She stood with her hands around the pot and felt, for the first time in 14 months, something she could not immediately name or file. 11 days after his arrival, the Duke told Lady Pemwick he would be extending his stay. Lady Pemwick received this with transparent delight, which meant she had decided to interpret his presence as social rather than investigative, which was precisely the kind of motivated reasoning that had kept her comfortable for 60 years. She began planning dinner parties. She began inviting the county's most eligible daughters to call. She began treating the Duke's presence in her house as a personal credential. She did not notice that he spent most evenings in the library. Mira noticed, because she worked in the library, at her unofficial desk in the corner, from 7 until 9 most evenings, when the household business of the day produced its paperwork, and she produced her accounting of it. She had been doing this for 14 months. The Duke arrived on the first Tuesday of his extended stay, sat in the chair nearest the fire, and opened a book. He did not explain his presence. She did not ask. He did not read. She noticed, without looking directly, that he turned pages with the irregular rhythm of a man looking at words without registering them. He looked at the fire for long intervals. Once, he looked at her, and when she glanced up because she had felt it, he looked back at his book. This continued for 3 evenings. On the 4th evening he said, without preamble, "How long were you managing the Pemwick accounts?" 14 months, Mira said. "And before that?" "My father's estate, for 3 years before his death." "Why?" She considered several answers. She chose the accurate one. "Because it needed doing, and I could do it." He made a sound that was not quite assent and not quite question. He turned a page. Then, after a pause, she had not timed, but had felt the weight of, "Your father was Gerald Ashworth." She looked up then. Properly. He was looking at the fire. His face, in profile, was the sort of face that gave nothing away without deciding to. "Yes," she said. "I knew him slightly. He was a decent judge of soil quality." Another pause. "I was sorry to hear of his death." She had been told this by several people in the 14 months since. None of them had included the bit about the soil quality. It was the most accurate condolence she had received, and it arrived 14 months late, and it undid something in her chest that she had not known was still wound tight. She did not let this show. She said, "Thank you, Your Grace," and looked back at her ledger. But the ledger blurred for 2 seconds, just 2, before she made it stop. She thought about her father that night. She thought about the estate in spring, before the creditors, and the particular smell of the kitchen garden when the damp got into the soil and released something green and private. She thought about how he used to walk the rows in the early morning and press his thumb into the earth to test it, and how he had taught her to do the same, and how she had not done it since because it was the kind of thing you did when the earth was yours. Her windowsill the next morning held no flowers. The absence was, somehow, louder than the presence had ever been. She stood at the window looking at the bare stone ledge and felt a small, particular loss that embarrassed her in its clarity. There were no flowers the morning after, either. On the third morning, she was in the kitchen garden at 5:30, bent over the row of winter kale, pressing her thumb into the soil the way her father had, when she heard footsteps on the frost-hardened path. She knew the weight of them by now. She stood up. The Duke was 20 feet away on the garden path, wearing his charcoal wool greatcoat and an expression she had not seen on him before, which was to say an expression, rather than the careful absence of one. He had something in his hand. It took her a moment to identify it, a small paper packet of the kind used for storing seeds. "There are no flowers this time of year," he said, "properly speaking." She looked at the paper packet. "You have been leaving them," she said. It was not a question. He did not pretend it was. He looked at her steadily and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "For 3 weeks," she said. "5," he said. "I passed through the county in September on my way north. I was here for 2 days. No one knew." A pause. "I saw you at the library window, working." She had been at the library window in September. She had been working. She tried to reconstruct herself at that window, seen from the garden path, and found the image both ordinary and oddly intimate, in the way that being watched without your knowledge is always intimate. "You left flowers on a windowsill," she said, "for a woman you had never met." He was quiet for a moment. Then, not quite an explanation, not quite an excuse. "My mother used to say that people who work in the dark deserve something alive in their line of sight." Mira looked at the packet of seeds in his hand. The morning was very cold. Her breath made small clouds. His did too. "What are those?" she asked. "Winter aconite. They will come up in January." He held them out, not with ceremony. Simply held them out, in the way you hold something out to a person you believe is capable of taking it. She took the packet. The paper was warm from his hand. They stood in the frost for a moment, and the silence between them was not an empty silence. It was the kind of silence that has been building for 5 weeks on a windowsill. Then she said, "I will need a cold frame. The north wall doesn't get enough protection." "I know where there is one," he said. "Tobias has a spare." She had the passing, slightly dizzying thought that Tobias had known all along, and that Tobias was a man who kept more counsel than she had given him credit for. "Come and look at the kale," she said. "The soil drainage near the east row is wrong. I should like a second opinion." He came. He pressed his thumb into the soil the way she had. He told her what he thought, which was informed and specific, and she told him where she disagreed, which was on one particular point she was quite certain about, and he considered this, and said she was probably right. They stood in the kitchen garden in the cold and talked about soil drainage and winter brassicas for 20 minutes, and neither of them talked about any of the other things that were also there, because the garden was enough of an honesty for one morning. He extended his stay for another 2 weeks after that. 14 days passed in the following way. Mornings in the garden before 6, and this had become in its quiet structure a shared thing, without discussion or appointment. She was there, he was there, and they walked the rows and argued about nothing consequential. Days in which he was occupied with his solicitor, and she was occupied with the household books, and they did not see each other. Evenings in the library, where he read with the same irregular page-turning, and she kept accounts, and once, only once, he said, unprompted, "Read me what you are working on," and she read him 3 lines of a particularly cryptic entry in the kitchen accounts, and he laughed, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was a good sound, slightly surprised, as if he had not intended it. She had not made anyone laugh in 14 months. She had not particularly tried. On the Wednesday of the second week, Lady Pemwick invited the Marchioness of Salton to tea, along with the Marchioness's unmarried daughter, and made pointed conversational gestures in the Duke's direction for 90 minutes. He was polite, he was efficient. He left the drawing room after exactly 1 hour and found Mira in the hall, preparing a delivery list, and said, with no context whatsoever, "The Salton girl cannot tell the difference between a balance sheet and a broadsheet." Mira said, she also mispronounced Westmoreland, and he said 3 times, and they did not say anything else about it, and went back to their respective work. At the end of the second week, his secretary arrived from Aldenmere with 2 trunks and a letter, and the Duke came to the library that evening, with the letter in his hand. He sat. He did not open his book. He looked at the letter, then at her. "I have to go back," he said. "There is an estate matter that requires my presence." She kept her eyes on the ledger. She added a column of figures. She arrived at a correct total and did not feel it. "Of course," she said. A pause. Then, "I would like you to come with me." She looked up. "To Aldenmere," he said, "as the estate accounts keeper. The position has been vacant for 11 months. My previous man retired, and I have not found anyone I trust with the complexity of the books." He looked at her directly. He had a way of looking at her directly that was not quite like being looked at by other people. "You are the most thorough person I have encountered in a professional capacity in 6 years. The salary is £95 per year. You would have proper rooms, south-facing." She put her pen down. She looked at him for a long moment. £95. More than 7 times what she earned at Pemwick Hall. South-facing rooms. A position with a title and a proper function, and her name on the books as the accounts keeper, not the invisible hand, making other people's dishonesty legible. "Is this out of obligation?" she said. "Because of the Pemwick matter?" "No," he said. "Is it charity?" she said. "No," he said again. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the slight effort of a man who does not use words like this often, "It is a genuine post, with a genuine salary, because you are genuinely the best person for it." A pause. "It is also the only arrangement I have been able to construct that places you, in practical terms, where I would like you to be." She looked at him. He looked back. "Where is that?" she said. Though she knew. The winter garden in the frost, the shared soil testing, the evenings in the library, the 5 weeks of flowers on a window he had never been told was hers. She had known for some time where all of that was pointing, and she had been precise enough in her own accounting to admit it. "Here," he said, simply, near enough to argue with. She thought about her father's estate in spring. She thought about her north-facing room, and the cold, and the flowers that had arrived every morning, like a small declaration from someone who had not yet found the words for it. She thought about the clay pot of winter jasmine still sitting on her windowsill, because she had not put it down. She thought about the difference between being saved and being chosen, and how she had not been naive enough at 32 to confuse them. "I will come to Aldenmere as your accounts keeper," she said, "on the understanding that the position is a genuine one, that I answer to you on financial matters, and to no one else on how I conduct the work, that the salary is paid monthly, not quarterly, and that I will tell you when you are wrong about the books, because you will occasionally be wrong about the books." "I know," he said. There was that sound again, the almost surprised one. "I am counting on it." She held out her hand. He took it, and his grip was the kind that does not perform itself, but simply exists, steady and without theater. "Then we have an arrangement," she said. They left Pemwick Hall on a Saturday, 8 days later, with a single coach and the morning frost still hard on the gravel. Lady Pemwick saw them off from the top step with an expression that had passed through several phases of calculation and arrived at something that resembled dignity, which was, Mira thought, the most she could reasonably expect from her. Tobias was in the kitchen garden when Mira passed through it one last time, and he looked up from his work and nodded once, and she nodded back, and that was all they needed. The journey to Aldenmere took most of a day. They spent parts of it in conversation, and parts of it in the easy silence of people who have already discovered they can share a quiet room. He told her about the estate, 1,200 acres, 2 home farms, a timber concern that was being reorganized, accounts of sufficient complexity to constitute, as he put it without apparent irony, a full-time engagement. She told him about her father's methods for soil assessment, and he said some of them were sound, and some of them were idiosyncratic, and she said that had been precisely the point. Aldenmere appeared in the late afternoon light as a long, pale stone facade set against the gray-purple of the moor, with windows that caught the low sun and threw it back in warm squares. It was not small. It was not the house of a man who considered his own comfort to be the whole of what mattered, though. There were kitchen gardens visible from the drive, and a working yard, and the particular lived-in solidity of a place that had been genuinely inhabited rather than merely maintained. Her rooms were on the south side. They were warm. From the window she could see the kitchen garden and, at the far edge of it, a cold frame against the south wall. The clay pot came with her. She put it on the south-facing sill and looked at it in the better light and thought, this is a different kind of window. In the first week at Aldenmere, she found the estate accounts in reasonably good order and one significant error in the timber ledger that had been compounding quietly for 2 years. She corrected it. She told him about it at dinner that evening, with the same plain directness she had used with Mr. Farrand, and he listened and asked 2 sharp questions and accepted her answers and said, "Good, what else?" "Not yet," she said. "I have been here a week." "Then come back to this when you have had another week," he said. "I would rather know late than not know." She thought, yes, this is the kind of house. The winter aconite she had planted in the cold frame came up in January, as he had said they would. Small, yellow, precise, improbably cheerful in the gray light. She brought 2 stems in and put them in a glass on her desk, which was her desk, with her name in the household records as the accounts keeper of the estate of Aldenmere, salary £95 per annum, paid monthly. He found her there one January morning, standing at the window looking at the kitchen garden with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold. He stopped in the doorway of the accounts room, as he did sometimes, and looked at her in that inventory way. "You are not working," he said. "I am thinking," she said. "It is a related activity." He came into the room. He stood beside her at the window and looked at the kitchen garden, which in January offered very little to look at, and yet they looked at it for a moment, side by side. "Mira," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. She had noticed the absence of it for weeks. It landed now with the small, precise weight of something meant. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the expression that was not an absence of expression but rather an expression he had built carefully and was now, deliberately, dismantling. "I want to make the arrangement different," he said. "I want to make it more." He did not reach for her. He stood with his hands at his sides like a man who has decided to be honest rather than strategic, and he said, "I am asking, not assuming." She set down the cold cup of tea. She turned to face him properly, and the morning light through the south window was pale and thin and very clear, and in it she could see him as he was, a man who had left flowers on a windowsill for 5 weeks for a woman he had not yet spoken to, because his mother had said that people who work in the dark deserve something alive in their line of sight, and because he had seen her there and thought of her and not known how else to say it. She thought of the difference between being saved and being chosen, again, and she thought that this was what chosen felt like, standing in your own room, with your name on the ledger of your own employment, with a man who was asking rather than arranging, and knowing that what you said next mattered, because you had made it matter. "I am not interested in gratitude," she said, "and I am not interested in charity. I never was." "I know," he said. "That is why I am asking." "Then yes," she said, "more, but on equal terms. You may be the Duke, but I keep the books, and the books do not lie." "I know that too," he said. "I have known it since October." He reached out and took her hand, the same steadiness as before, the same grip without theater, and she held it back with the calm of a woman who has survived 14 months of cold rooms and bad arithmetic, and emerged knowing precisely what she was worth and what she would and would not accept. Outside the south window, the kitchen garden held its bare winter bones in the gray January light. The cold frame against the south wall was bright with yellow aconite. The moor beyond it was purple and immense, and completely indifferent to the fact that inside this room, 2 people had arrived, slowly and precisely, and without any particular dramatic announcement, at something that was going to hold. That is the thing about people who have survived loss without theater. When they finally choose, they choose clearly. No hedging, no half measures. They know what they are doing, and they do it with both hands. And perhaps you know that feeling too, the particular solidity of a thing you chose for yourself, rather than a thing that simply happened while you were surviving something else. That is what Mira found at the south window. Not rescue, not charity, an equal footing, in a house that finally faced the light.